You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I am Dustin and Tony is with me and we are here to discuss everything from January 27th through February 2nd. There's a bunch of news that actually happened over the past week. There's some new numbers that have been released from some of the major streaming services. There's also some minor announcements that we're going to discuss as well. And we're going to talk about some watch patterns with Wonder Woman 1984 getting some actual numbers from Nielsen, as well as an update on The Office being viewed more on Peacock. So we'll talk about that towards the end of the episode. But we're going to start off with service updates. And while there is a ton of news, and I say this because there's probably 3 times more news than there has been the last couple weeks. Things have gotten back to some sort of sense of normalcy. So if you're taking a look at the show notes, there's a lot more there than there has been in the last couple weeks. That said, there's only a couple things we're going to talk about this time around. So the first thing I want to talk about is Modern Family. So this actually happened right before we recorded the last episode, but it didn't make it into our show notes. But Modern Family, which is a very successful show that aired on ABC here in the United States, it's concluded its run, and I believe they ended up with 11 seasons. And obviously any show that can go 10 plus seasons is going to, garner in some way, shape, or form a significant streaming deal. And as it turns out, Modern Family was not appearing anywhere. I think it was actually, I take that back. I think it was at one point on Hulu, but there's a new deal in place where not only will it be on Hulu, but it'll also be on Peacock as well. And some people might ask, well, how in the world is a show that was originally on a station owned by Disney ending up over on a service such as Peacock? And interestingly, the show itself was actually produced by 20th Century Fox Television. That explains why it would have potentially been on Hulu, because Disney does own the show. But at the same time, we also know that Disney doesn't have the necessity, as it does with their Disney-specific shows, to keep them on Hulu. And this is an example of them licensing content elsewhere. Also, there's currently an existing deal. Disney and Comcast still have a deal in place because there is still the matter of paying Comcast the remainder of what they owe them in order for Disney to take full control over Hulu. So maybe this is part of it. Maybe it's not. I honestly would assume it has something to do with the eventual dismissal of Comcast leaving Hulu and Disney completely owning it. But in the meantime, this is a pretty big deal because it's another big, long-running show that has ended up on multiple services, similar into the vein of South Park or some of the other Comedy Central shows, or even Rick and Morty, which is also on Hulu as well as HBO Max.
This is pretty interesting, just the fact of a show as big as Modern Family is on both Peacock and Hulu. I think that there's probably some lingering, licensing, agreements, whatever issues due to the Disney acquisition of Fox and then, buying out, Comcast's shares at the very end of that deal, giving, Disney this whole ownership of Hulu. So yeah, there's probably something lingering there, but I think a deal of the scope of having Peacock and Hulu both having Modern Family, just a very popular and huge, sitcom is very noteworthy. And I'm curious to see how it plays out for both people. I mean, I think throughout the news recently for Peacock, we've seen them boast about the numbers between, The Office and Parks and Rec and stuff like that on their service. So I'm curious how Modern Family's numbers will do, given that it's going to be on Peacock and Hulu at the same time. And what is the adoption at Hulu as well, if they ever release numbers of how many people are viewing Modern Family as well, just to see just an apples to apples comparison there. But overall, this is a pretty interesting deal. How do you feel about the split breakdown of the episodes that are on Peacock for free? So I guess to explain, it says that the first 12 episodes of the first, season, which is 24 episodes. So the first half of the first season is going to be on Peacock for free for everybody to watch. But then after that midway point of the first season, then you have to go on a Peacock Premium. So I, as a user, have tried to get onto Peacock. I found the strategy just annoying because, they said they have a free tier, and yet the amount of content that you can watch is kind of restrictive if you really want to do a deep dive on something. So how do you feel about this weird breakdown between free and premium tier and getting half of a season and stuff like that?
Personally, it doesn't bother me because I typically don't. I personally don't tend to use the free tiers on services in general. However, I will say that this is becoming a regular occurrence with high-profile shows on Peacock, because obviously they just did this exact same thing with The Office. The difference, of course, was that I believe it was the first 3 seasons that were free, and then the rest had to be on Peacock Premium. But then the other thing that is also part of the announcement is that Modern Family will also have a lot of that deleted content or the extra content that isn't available just typically watching the show, just as they just did with The Office. And that's something that'll be exclusive on Peacock compared to Hulu. I think the idea of bringing somebody in who's interested in watching a show, especially for people who aren't necessarily subscribing to Peacock. I mean, let's be honest, Peacock, which we're going to talk about their new numbers now or in just a little bit here, but they've got a lot of users. The question is, how many of them are actually paying for the service and are actually on that premium tier? So I'm guessing the intent is the vast majority of Peacock users are on that free tier, as we all suspected. And because they're on that free tier, if they are able to watch the first 10 episodes of a series for free, they might get hooked and want to check out the rest. And then, what do you know? The remainder of the other 10 seasons that are available right there on the service, you just have to pay $5 to be able to watch them for the month. And I think that's, in some ways, it's a good marketing method of getting people to acknowledge that content not only exists, but, to draw people in, because everybody is always looking for the content. If you're not subscribed to Peacock and you're looking for something specific and you happen to find out it's on Peacock, especially in a show like this, which is high profile, being able to watch the first 10 episodes, is going to potentially draw you into the service. You can't go over to Hulu and watch the first 10 episodes. You don't have that ability to do that anywhere else unless you go purchase the entire series, or you purchase the first season, that is. So I think it's a smart move on Peacock, but I only think it's going to work for these high-profile series that are going to draw people in by themselves, not, necessarily the series that they just acquire quietly and nobody's really talking about. I think a lot of there's the potential, of course, for other series to do this. Big Bang Theory, which is over on HBO Max, that's another great example of a high-profile series that is available out there that they could potentially do something like this, but obviously it's at HBO Max. Friends is another example. These are shows that they kind of like are shows of a generation type situation. I think that's a good example of great marketing.
It is great marketing, let's put it that way. But I guess my pushback is just the naive optimist, I guess, is taking my first approach with this. Was the fact of, okay, they've been promoting this free tier, they're promoting this premium tier, right? And so I was expecting, I don't know, usually when you hear free tier, it's like, okay, you're going to have ads or something or whatnot. Then the premium tier is, okay, you don't have ads. There's that story. But with Peacock, like, yes, for these bigger name shows, okay, with premium, you also get this exclusive bonus content or a bunch of, for The Office, deleted scenes and whatnot. So I was expecting that as well. But when they hype so much about, you can get the premium, the free tier, but when you really use the app and like major shows, you can't really watch that much content. And that's, to me, the most frustrating part is, I don't want to say it's like a false promise, but it is. I just personally feel it's misleading. Like, you can come on Peacock and watch like Superstore. Well, no, you need a premium subscription. Okay, I want to watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine. No, you need a premium subscription. The Office. Well, the first season's only like 6 episodes, so you can watch the first 2 seasons. All right, well, that's okay. I guess I'm going to the point of like, it doesn't feel, the free tier just isn't really worth it. And so if they just come out and say like, okay, like, hey, just do $5.99, you get everything you want, that's perfect, like that's totally fine. But this idea of, okay, you can get the free tier and you can really get something out of it, just feels false in my opinion. But again, that's like me as a user complaining, not necessarily me as the analyst looking at it. Like you said, it is a great marketing ploy, because if you're really into this content, it's going to force you to get the subscription. But as the consumer, it's like, I feel a little bit let down by the false promise.
Yeah, and I can understand that. I think that there's the idea of a free tier, when you're using a service like Pluto, or you're using a service like
IMDb TV.
Yeah, or IMDb TV is a good example too.
They have tons of like awesome television content, and like, yes, they have some ads, but very great experience. We'll talk about this later in the show, but I just wanted to bring that up. Like, I'm in comparison in Peacock in my head earlier. Then, man, what about something else that I could think of? Like IMDb TV. It's like, man, they have a lot of big name shows, but the experience is it's very nice, which is annoying in comparison to the free tier Peacock.
Right. And I think that's the biggest problem with Peacock is that because they're trying to be so many different things at once, it presents a problem because they're going to start getting compared. If you were on Peacock Premium without ads, so the high-end premium, you could say that is comparable to HBO Max, not as far as the amount of content or the quality of content, but just that's how you could compare it. Or, like Netflix, because it's ad-free and they have content, but they don't have as much content as those other options. So is $10 a month too much? Well, then you go to the ad tier. Well, there's not a lot of services that are actually offering a tier that, that's ad supported that for a lower price at this exact moment. So there's that. So they've got that's the one area that they have going for them. But then, of course, there's the free tier, which is going to be compared to IMDb TV or Pluto or Tubi. And the problem is that there's a limit on how much content you can have on there, especially when you're at the same time trying to get people to pay $5 a month for the higher tier that offers more content and still ad supported. So I think ultimately, eventually, they're going to have to figure out exactly what method to really focus on. And right now, it seems like their major focus is on the free tier just because that's what's getting them the signups, which is all that they keep talking about every time they announce their numbers. All right, so next up, let's just jump into IMDb TV. So, interestingly, IMDb TV has landed on Roku devices. Now, the reason why this is a very interesting article or announcement is that IMDb TV obviously is very similar to the Roku channel's offering, where the Roku channel has content that is ad-supported, that is free, and now IMDb TV is offered on there as well. And despite the fact that they're competing against each other, and not only the devices, but also streaming in this sense even more directly because IMDb TV is so related to the Roku channel. It's there and it's available, and I think this is a big deal because it shows that even while Peacock and HBO Max, HBO Max ended up working out deals with Roku and Prime Video, while Peacock is still trying to figure out how to get on Amazon Prime device or Amazon devices. The big thing is that somehow Roku and Amazon have figured out a way to work with each other, because not only is Prime Video and IMDb TV on Roku, but the Roku channel is actually on Prime device or on Amazon devices a couple months back. We that was in the show notes. So it's kind of interesting to see competitors kind of working with each other.
Yeah, I mean it's especially interesting given the relationship that Amazon has had with Roku. I think past, was it 2019, 2020, trying to get, I remember that there was a spat there. I can't quite remember it, but I know that there was something interesting there with contract negotiations. So it was quite surprising to see them do this deal. And I think it just gives some extra legitimacy to IMDb TV. So we've talked about IMDb TV multiple times on our show, and I just as a consumer was like, okay, well, let me go check it out. And I try to look for an app on Roku, and I couldn't at the time. And so then I realized that it was actually in Prime Video, but it was kind of like hidden away, buried, and it was kind of hard to get to. But it was all right. It was just really hard when you wanted to go watch some IMDb TV content to get to it. So if they definitely want to expand like the reach of the service and trying to get more eyes on it in comparison to Prime Video, I think that putting it in its own separate app is a good first start. I open it up today. I mean, I'm going to use it because I like the content that's on there. It's missing some features. There's no like watch list. There's nothing that you can like star and remind you and like get it from the queue later. It's pretty, bare bones, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. And I'm curious to see if Amazon is going to expand this idea with, okay, let's get the IMDb TV channel on the Apple TV device, the Google TV device, its own separate app yet. I mean, it's interesting if it's not already, and it's on the Roku first. I think that's quite surprising.
All right, so our last service update is kind of a different one. So we've talked about stereotypes and racist stereotypes with Disney Plus, and not only Disney Plus, but HBO Max. This was back in June of last year. We talked about how the services themselves were addressing some of the racist stereotypes that were appearing in some of their older content. And while Disney has had some content that they've just never offered in a streaming format, such as Song of the South, which is probably the most well-known example of content like that, there are other classic Disney films that feature some racist stereotypes, including Dumbo and Peter Pan and the Aristocats, and as well as Lady and the Tramp. And over the years, those elements within those films have been brought up over over and over again. And one of the things that I've noticed recently is that there was a quick trend that happened a couple weeks back, at least within the last month. Maybe it went back further, but it was the first time I saw it was in the last couple weeks, where there was a trend on TikTok that basically was, show me a moment in a Disney movie that showcases something racist. And it was something where people were actually doing this. But anyway, long story short, a lot of those films, those classic films outside of Song of the South, are available on Disney Plus. And when we talked about this last summer, one of the things that they did, this was even before then, was they made sure that the movies that did feature some sort of racist stereotype had a warning on the title card that would show you that there was an issue with something in the film. They didn't necessarily explain what exactly it was, but they said, this is not something that the company views nowadays. And this is not how the company, feels about these specific things that appear in the films. So a good example, Aristocrats, there's a scene that features a cat that I believe is supposed to be a Chinese. They're representing a Chinese person, but it's in a very stereotypical way. And the same thing happens with the Siamese cats in Lady and the Tramp, and the same thing happens with Native Americans in Peter Pan. And now it has actually come to Disney Plus's attention that they don't want young people, meaning people under the age of 7, to actually see these things, regardless of whether there's the warning or not, because most kids under the age of 7 are not reading a warning. They're just watching the film. So if you have your child's ratings set up, parental control set up, where they can only watch content that is deemed TV 7 FV and G, that means all of those films, which were, of course, originally rated G, including Peter Pan and Aristocats, those films are now no longer to be able to be viewed on those child's profiles. Basically, the only way to view those films is if you allow content at a higher rating, and obviously the adult profiles will still have those films available. But this is another way for Disney to make sure that children aren't getting the wrong impression from something as classic as a Disney film.
This has always been a trick, not for me personally, for I think people in general, of what do you do, this whole idea of content moderation in the streaming age. I think that this was, obviously, right, these racist stereotypes have been in these movies since they were first created. I think that's an obvious point. But I think the difference between now and maybe 20 years ago is that the only way to really get this content was either VHS or DVD. There was no streaming service which was really easily available for kids to stumble across content. Like if you wanted kids to watch certain content, then they would have to actually own the physical medium to actually watch the content. So in the age of streaming, in the age of kids consuming so much streaming content, I appreciate Disney of taking the step of leaving it to the parents to make their decisions and putting steps in place for parents to shield kids from these stereotypes if they so choose. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the best idea, the best remedy to handle these properties that have racist content. I feel like that's a different discussion. But from a simple of, if this content's still going to be on Disney Plus and how do we work around that, I feel like this is a really great way to have some type of permissions structure in making sure that this kid can watch this content due to this content rating. And I'm actually pretty not surprised, but I think it's pretty good that I think the normal TV ratings are due to either language or violence, stuff like that. Disney kind of just made one up that's okay. Does it have racist stereotypes as a new label? I think that's pretty inventive, as well as I think other services and companies are going to take the same approach moving forward. So I appreciate Disney making these steps.
All right, so let's get into some numbers. So let's talk about HBO Max first. They also had their numbers popped up just this past week, along with Peacock, but let's talk about HBO Max first. So they've had an enormous amount of growth in the past quarter. They jumped up to a total of 41.5 million subscribers across HBO and HBO Max. Out of that, there is 37 million subscribers that are HBO Max specific. These are people who have, that have the ability to have it through wholesale or through retail, which means people are getting the service for free through the wholesale, and the retail would be people who specifically subscribed through the HBO Max app or HBOMax.com. But they've also decreased the number of people who don't have access to HBO Max through the original HBO options. So there's a lot of things. The other big number here is the activations. Last quarter, their activations were at 8.6 million, and that was the total across all of their devices. And then this quarter actually jumped, they doubled the number, and it was 17.2 is what they ended up with, which is a huge number. They attribute the fact that Wonder Woman 1984 helped them get a lot of this. They also made sure to be aware that they're not anticipating these massive jumps every single quarter, but they're super happy about this, and it also brings them to the goal that they had actually set for year 2 of HBO Max being live, and that's all within less than a year. So obviously bringing Wonder Woman 1984 to the service was a gamble, and it paid off for them, at least for now it has. We'll see what happens in the future, but they're very happy about what's happening with HBO Max right now. And one thing I want to point out, in the show notes, there's a section under the discussion section at the bottom. Brendan Brady, who does some work over at A Ton of Data, he actually posted up a tweet explaining the breakdown of all the HBO subscribers, which is well more detailed than I think anything you're going to find, so definitely check that out. Let's jump over to Peacock, and they have stated that their current number sits at 33 million signups. Now, obviously, back in December, they said that they were at 28 million, so they've gained another 5 million over the last month. And I have to say, this is still one of those things where I have to wonder how many people are actually paying for the service, because they're not really talking about that aspect of it. And that's the part that I think a lot of people should be asking the question of, because 33 million signups is great. No question about it. I mean, in some ways, you could compare that number of signups to, in some ways, Disney Plus, because they have had a significant number of signups. 33 million signups, might I add, is only coming from the US, because Peacock isn't available elsewhere. So that's a lot of signups within the US. However, if that translates to maybe only 5 million people are actually paying for the service or actually having access to it, that are, I say that, but every Comcast customer also has access to the ad tier, the Peacock Premium, the middle $5 tier for free. So the question is people actually paying for the service, or are they really just banking on the fact that hopefully over the course of time, more and more people will start paying as they add content, and this free tier is really just going to kind of scoot them by with investors for the time being?
I completely agree. I'm a little bit, I have the same skepticism as you have about these Peacock. Part of it is, yes, I wonder how many people did the free tier but aren't really using the service. I am of that camp. I have a suspicion that there are, a significant number, not a majority or anything like that, but there's a significant number of people that are in the same boat. I'm curious about the amount of people who, what are they watching? Is it just like The Office and Parks and Rec and Brooklyn Nine-Nine? I'm curious what's the distribution of shows that they're watching, because that might indicate something in the future of, okay, if everybody is just watching The Office, Parks and Rec, these, classic sitcoms, as much as many times as I love rewatching that content, you're going to get into a lull. You're going to want to get into something else. And if Peacock doesn't have a, huge breadth of content to watch, then, people would, move away from the service for a while. Usually it's okay for people to change different services or drop one and move to another one, because that's just how the nature of the game is. People, move from one to another. However, eventually people might circle back to the streaming service at the very, where you first started. Like for me, I started with Netflix. I went away, and I probably will go back to Netflix because of some content. But Peacock right now, it's okay. You might move away from Peacock because you watch so much of The Office, you watch some other content, and you might not come back to Peacock for a very long time. And you're going to lose money that way for Peacock, because the ad tier, right? They still need eyeballs to watch ads. There's that as well. I'm curious from a revenue standpoint. I know that they're not necessarily breaking even or making a profit or whatever. By comparison to HBO Max, okay, we can make we can have a debate about, okay, what is considered an activation, how much is actually HBO Max's true growth versus just converting all HBO original customers to, I think people can have the debate all day long, but they're still paying $10-15 for a subscription, either way you want to say it. So they're still putting down some cash. Whereas in Peacock, you have this ad tier. We have no clue how the ad buys are working or the price points on those, because for at least on the cable side, ad revenue has been down due to COVID. I'm not saying that there's a true correlation to that in the streaming world, but that is something that you have to be concerned about as well. And then how many premium people are there? And, the premium tier, how much are they paying? So I think there's a whole lot of information there that we're lacking, and just the activations alone does not answer all the potential questions that one might ask. So I'm in the same boat with you. Is these numbers are, I think, great to start like a call with investors and really inject some optimism into how things are, but there's still a lot of open-ended questions, and there's a lot left to be seen of how viable the service is.
All right, so that is the numbers. That's the latest numbers we have. And now I want to move into our last topic, which is watch patterns. And this has to do with, well, I want to start off with The Office and on Peacock, because last week I made a big deal about how could The Office be watched more on Peacock than it was on Netflix. If Netflix has a significantly larger number of subscribers, that just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But I guess the people who were watching on Netflix and they jumped over to watching it on Peacock, they're watching it more consistently, because I say this because there's not a whole lot of information, because there's no actual stats other than just the trends. Parrot Analytics was where this originated from. There's some other ones that have picked up on trend data that shows that this is the case, but there's no actual numbers until Nielsen actually releases numbers for Peacock, which won't be happening anytime in the near future because Nielsen isn't monitoring Peacock. However, conveniently, when Comcast talked about their numbers for Peacock, they specifically said, the CEO did state that more people are watching The Office on Peacock than they were on Netflix. And I still don't understand where he's getting those numbers, because obviously he has the access to how many people are watching The Office on Peacock. That obviously he has access to, but I'm not sure how he would have access to how many people were watching it on Netflix, because I'm not sure Netflix would be giving him that information. That said, there is some other, like I said, there's some other ones that have popped up stating that this actually could be true. So I'm going to eat my words and say, for now, that seems to be the case. At least that is the narrative that is being presented, until we actually have some firm numbers that have to do with viewing and not just trends. But so I have to make a point to say that, because last episode I called that out as not being possible. But I suppose it is possible. I just don't feel like it's very likely. But the other big news was that Wonder Woman 1984 has actually, there's some updated numbers from Nielsen for the week of Christmas. So this is specifically the week of December 21st to the 27th. And if you remember, we talked about, I believe it was last episode, about how Soul was the number one film for the week, and I specifically brought up the fact that, well, how is it that we are comparing or saying Soul was the number one film when another major film, Wonder Woman 1984, came out on HBO Max, and of course Nielsen's not monitoring HBO Max up at this point. So the question is, how exactly is it that this could be true? You can't say that this is positively true considering you're not monitoring the other film. Now, as it turns out, somehow Warner Media gave access to Nielsen for the week on HBO Max, and specifically it was found out that Wonder Woman 1984 was viewed 2.2 billion minutes of streaming over the course of the week. That means it was 35% better than the 1.7 billion minutes that Soul had over on Disney Plus, which is a huge jump. The other thing to consider is that Wonder Woman did have 45 minutes longer of a runtime compared to Soul, so there's that. But it does show that, one, the film did very well, and this is actually a finite way. Now, not that I was saying that Soul couldn't, and like I said last week, Soul isn't necessarily the film that wasn't going to be number one viewed, because as Tony pointed out last week, the big thing is that it's a film meant for children, which means they're going to watch it over again and over again, and that's going to rack up minutes. As we know, children's content gets viewed a lot more than adult content. So while I wasn't sitting here saying that it wasn't possible for Soul, it's actually surprising that Wonder Woman 1984 was viewed just that much more. It means that more people turned out to watch it than maybe the number of people that actually turned out to watch Soul. So, I mean, great on HBO Max for this. I hope that this means that very soon here we're going to be getting more numbers from Nielsen when it comes to HBO Max. We know that Nielsen has stated that Peacock and HBO Max are going to start being monitored in 2021. I just hope that it's happening sooner rather than later. All right, and with that is everything for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for all the articles that we talked about here and a bunch of articles that we have not talked about that have happened over the past week. In addition to that, you can check out the trailers that we have that have come out over the past week as well. Those are in the show notes. You can find those at thestreamingwars.io. You can follow us on Twitter and join our Discord to find all these articles throughout the week as they come out. And that is where you'll see them. You can also follow us on Instagram for all latest announcements related to new episodes of the podcast posting. You can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, topics you'd like us to discuss on future episodes, as well as any feedback you'd like to give us or wherever you are listening to this podcast. Please take the time to send us some feedback. That is always greatly appreciated and truly helps the show get to more people. With all of that being said, for Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.